So anyhow, this is the last panel. There's a title up there, Forging a Collaborative Agenda for Scientific Advancement. We've, let's flip the slide. Oh, I have to flip it. So anyhow, we've reframed the title to fit what we're really going to talk about slightly as challenges and opportunities for conducting research in settings, systems, and policies, and the commensurate funding opportunities. So individually and or collectively, so Reed doesn't hold our feet to the fire. During the first hour, we'll try to address the following set of questions and challenges. In the second hour, we hope to engage you in addressing the same set of questions and challenges. So the first question we're going to take a look at is, what should a science of intervention research that weds PYD and PS look like? Secondly, at what level of analysis or intervention should such an action science take place? That is, with individuals, settings, systems, and or policies. Thirdly, what are the unique research challenges and advances needed at each level of analysis or intervention for the development of an action science? And fourth, what are the commensurate funding opportunities and constraints at each level of analysis? Now we can, and we're going to go in the order that was up there, with me mouthing off first, trying to time myself. If Susan, you want to time me better, give me 15 minutes, or 14, whatever is left.
He's got his hand.
Oops, hold on, I have to get my picture here or else I keep my glasses on and off and that won't work. Conjoining positive youth development and prevention science, for me, demands rethinking. PYD and PS are neither conceptual nor practical matches. PYD really implies promotion that we've talked about yesterday more so than prevention. It doesn't mean prevention is incompatible with it, but you have to lead with promotion, not lead with prevention. And prevention more often leads to individuals as the locus of intervention and change, as for example in the life skills training program. What the target of intervention there is and the locus of change is individuals. It's nothing at a higher level. Got too many things here. Me and Jerry Ford can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so the promotion demands a focus on units of analysis that influence larger numbers of individuals, like settings, which are really what we've talked about. Joe's example is, one of our poster children for that. Social environments in which people experience their daily life. Classrooms and schools are illustrations, youth-serving organizations, families. Then we can talk about systems and cross-systems, which include things like education and human services, and policies are all levels of analysis that we should be talking about. The punchlines, what I want to communicate is that we have an underdeveloped scientific understanding of how these different units of analysis operate. And here I want you to, not looking for the source of the light, but I want to move the light away from individuals, which we keep going back to. I think it's intellectually important, it's critical. I spent the first 20 years of my life in a bottomless pit. Because you get all these NIMH grants, you're developing your individual as you're interested in system change and other things, and then there's no resources left. We know far more about individual stuff. And so it's not that it's irrelevant, but we can't, if we're really serious about having a promotion science, we've got to move the light and pay more attention to some of the things I'm going to talk about. So we need to develop an action science of settings, systems, and policies toward the twin goals of understanding and improving the way in which we can foster PYD. Baby steps have been taken toward an action science of social settings. Joe's example was a perfect one. But there are a lot of further developments in theory, assessment, intervention, research, design, and analysis that are needed. And far more progress is needed in developing our understanding and improving of system and policy levels of analysis. Jonathan's going to talk about some of that. I won't talk about much of that because I'll be too... Doesn't like me. Now, I'm technologically incompetent, so Friday night I was trying to make this, so this is awful, but, you know, the times have passed me by. I
understand.
But really, what we're really going to talk about, I'm going to be talking mostly about something like this, where we're talking about the setting, the proximal settings, whether it be a school or a classroom or an out-of-school program, and how it affects positive youth development. So I'm going to focus on this sort of the setting level. But, you know, just in terms of the foundation too, when I got there, we had broad issues of like studying context. And the kind of stuff you get in the door when you say that is all over the place and never very rigorous. So we decided we had to break this down to move the field, and we started with settings. We were interested in systems and policies, but that's even harder to get a handle on in a rigorous fashion. I personally am still committed to that, but so we started it at this kind of level. But you could see that these weird bars are really related to trying to change the social settings up here of a setting level. These are policies trying to change the educational system or the human service system, and those in turn have influences on all those too, but we're not there, and I'm not going to talk about what's there. Maybe Jonathan's going to shed some light on that. So we're going to talk about this.
And what was OST in that last one?
Out of school time programs. Yeah, there was just illustrations. There are many more. We could be talking about many more peer groups, neighborhoods. We could talk a lot, but it's where kids get their daily experiences is the issue, and they get them in families. And I didn't put families up there intentional because when you're talking about promotion, getting back to the public health model, that's not where you have. It's very hard to have a program with lots of families that you're going to influence lots of families. So you got to say, where is the locus of intervention that you can influence lots of people in the, as Rico pointed out, in the Rose kind of public health model. I think that's critical, and I think a lot of our discussion loses sight of that. And when we're talking about prevention or promotion, we're talking about the public health model. Okay, so we're not talking about indicated or targeted, even though I think there's good evidence that Catherine and other people have pointed out in other places that when you deal with those settings, the kids that usually get the major impact are the kids who need it most. So that's even more reason to go to that level. So this was just the little framework that we set up of a social setting, and this could be a family, a classroom, a school, an out-of-school setting, whatever. And we talked about, and this was trying to go across settings and have some conceptual framework to guide what we were looking at. So within a setting, I should just put that there. So the youth ed outcomes are a function of what goes on inside this black box. Okay, and the black box is made up of resources. It could be economic resources, human, social capital, and then there's the composition of resources. So, for example, the good behavior game is a good example of the composition of resources. And then we call this what's social here. Whoops, told you I was incompetent. We call the social regularities. The foundation called them really social processes, and we're talking about the relational notions that Rich started with, and we've come back to that notion, or the connectedness notion. There's various ways of thinking about social processes. I call them social regularities because, like Joe, Seymour was my god, and he talked about program regularities and behavioral regularities. But they're not behavioral. That's putting it in an individual level. It's between people, between groups. So that's why it's social. That's why they're social processes. The regularities are the ones that are really represent the homeostasis. So those are determinative. The social regularities are the kind of social processes that are determinative of the youth outcomes. And those are the ones that you're looking for to change. In Joe's example, the quality of school, the quality of teaching in the classroom, or the norms in a classroom. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at there. I might as well just look at this. This is driving me crazy. So I just told you all that. So the target of the change of social interventions is often those social regularities. But that assumes we know what's determining what the kid outcomes are. And for example, we know that the human resources, the teacher's education, a whole host of variables predict nothing about what happens to kids. Joe's is an example, Rivers is an example, the 4Rs project is an example of how the quality of classroom teaching does impact kids' outcomes, both socio-emotional and academic. So this is just some background. I said this yesterday, improving everyday settings has the potential to impact many children, and it's a promotive approach that then has preventive benefits. And important to me always has been, and this is my old community psych lingo, it really avoids blaming the victim, and it avoids iatrogenic effects. When you take a prevention frame to start with, you're more likely to be vulnerable to those kinds of effects. So there's a series of research questions for promotion science of settings. How does social settings operate? What are their mechanisms? Is kind of a key issue, and I'm talking about them as social regularities, but that has different, it could be in a family, it's often conflict, it can be connection, it can be a whole host of things. So it's not specifying what they are, you need to determine in that setting what they are and why those are the things that need to be changed. How can social settings be improved to affect positive youth development, which is obvious, follows from that, and how can measurement of social setting features and processes be improved? So all the wisdom that John imparted to us is really important, but we've tried to change where the light's focused and focus on what those, so how do you measure those social regularities in classrooms, in other places? How do we rigorously measure them, and how do we associate them with outcomes? And then these set of questions, I'm not going to talk much. I think these are really where we need to go, and I hope, again, Jonathan's going to talk some about them, but how do cross-setting interactions operate to enhance positive youth development? How can we measure them? So it's the same set of questions in some sense, moving cross-settings to systems and to policies. And they're all interrelated. So, so that's the grand plan, okay? So all of this has been helped by some recent stage setting events that have occurred. So you probably all know, Raudenbush and Sampson's sort of classic paper that really moved us away from psychometrics to ecometrics, studying the ecology and how do we measure the ecology. There were a couple other papers in the same arena. HLM allowed us to look at, individuals nested in time, nested in classrooms, nested in schools, those kinds of things. Those are all critical. We couldn't have even thought about these things. Oh shit. And then, Steve Raudenbush and Howard Bloom, and that actually there's a new edition of this now called Optimal Design Software Plus that is on our website, on the WT Grant website if you need it. And that tells you, how many schools you need to randomly assign if schools or classrooms of the unit analysis. And the plus part is Howard has now gone through all kinds of data that exist to get intra-class correlations and other things so you can estimate what you need to plug in to get your effect sizes. So there's increasing technology that makes this possible. Another plug for the optimal design software. If you can't figure it out and you don't get an answer, there's a consultation service. And Steve Raudenbush's former graduate student, Andreas, will answer your questions. If he can't, he'll go to Steve. So then the measuring social regularity. So out of some of the intervention work we were doing came this idea of we realized that we had to be measuring those regularities or those social processes. So, Joe's already talked about the classroom assessment scoring system. Charles Smith developed the Youth Program Quality Assessment Instrument, which is in after-school settings. It is a similar. It's not as rigorously sophisticated, but it's conceptually very useful. In those studies, they don't find impact on kids. They don't look at them because the kids constantly changing, but they are getting changes in the practices of the organizational practices. Charles Glisson has developed the organizational social context measure, which is really a measure of the culture and climate. It's a tapping into norms of child welfare clinics and mental health clinics. So I should give these up quick. So key issues in setting level research. In setting level research is really what's the unit of random assignment and analysis. And when we're doing this stuff, so Joe's talking about classrooms as the unit of analysis, and that's the unit of random assignment. Catherine's talking about schools as the unit of random assignment. And that has a whole host of different implications for measurement, for power, and what's the target of intervention. The target of intervention is the quality of classrooms. You're really talking about changing the norms and expectations. We also have some of David Henry's stuff on norms as norms towards aggression in classrooms. You could have norms about sort of positive expectations for all. So those are some of the kind of thing. And these are some other questions we've been struggling with, including how you can assess mediation. Let's see what I have here. So here I wanted to just give you an example of some sort of, so observations of patterns of interaction are a critical way of getting at social regularities. It's not appropriate for every kind of thing. It works with the class. People have done that with observations, live or videotape. People are now using daily diaries to do that, having kids do daily diaries of observations of the teacher in the classroom. You can begin to talk about norms, as I said, David Henry's thing, or Charles Glisson's work. So they're members' reports, but they're consensus measures. So the kids report on the classroom or the school. A key issue here that doesn't exist in lots of the work on norms, it's classic in all of Moose's work, is you use the aggregate score. Well, the aggregate score in itself could be very misleading. You need to be studying the heterogeneity. So if you don't have homogeneity of that measure, you're really not tapping into norms. More often you're tapping into some correlation with personality or demographic factors. There's a great article by Chan on that, 98, if you want reference. Social networks is another way to tap into a social regularity, particularly when you're talking about peers. So Wayne Osgood, working with the Prosper data, had bootlegged social network data on the whole Prosper study, and they've now just analyzed that data because their theory was where Prosper was working, or mostly in the treated versus untreated communities, it was the changing peer social networks that were carrying the effects and the reduction of substance abuse, and that's in fact what they found. So what happens is that, in some sense, the bad kid gets marginalized in the social networks over time. So they become, when they were the, sort of the node of the network, they become marginalized. So let's see. So you heard about Joe's. These were some that you didn't hear about. I'm not going to tell you about. So in altering social settings, altering classroom settings is possible by changing the social regularities. Specifically, interventions must target the practices, routines, interactions, and the climate of the setting. And this is sort of what we've learned from some of the work we've done. Alternatively, you can change the resources of their organization, but most of our studies have been impact only. With impact only, you don't learn what to improve. And even if you look at just resources, you don't learn what to improve because you don't know what the mechanisms that transpired are. So that's why, I think that it's the targeting, the practice, the routines, interactions, that's where our focus has to be, because that's what you can improve, and that's language that practitioners understand. Okay. Sort of some of the things we've learned from the series of studies we've done that we've really talked about today is, and I thought Reed's comments about looking at the coach teacher interactions is really critical, is the intensive one-on-one coaching and mentoring seems to be true in all of them. That's true in Charles Smith's work in after-school setting as well, and feedback of results and assessment of the intervention. That's all there. So you're empowering that teacher or that practitioner to improve. So one more comment: the mediation that Joe glanced over, we've been sort of struggling with, and so that and these are. And by the way, I'm looking like I'm a total experimental design geek, but we really feel multiple methods, and particularly mixed methods, is important, but the foci of my comment is not that. But the intervention is randomly assigned and you get change in youth outcomes. On the other hand, and then you get an effect here, so the intervention is actually randomly assigned to the mediator, but there's no random assignment here. So normal causal methods don't account for that. And Bloom and Raudenbush and other people have been working on propensity scores and other things. Nothing seems quite satisfactory. So the only thing there is you got to say it implies causality, or it looks like causal, but it's not. So there's sustainability issues, and the future challenges and conundrums for theory are, I know I'm over, need to embed setting theory in a researchable system theory, including the interactions among settings. For intervention, we need to restructure setting level regularities directly to create setting change, explore regulatory mechanisms such as policy and administrative orders to change settings and their regularities, measurement, find ways to balance the trade-off between validity and reliability, need to develop reliable, valid, practical, and cost-effective instruments, need instruments that tap dynamic and transactional components of settings because it moves over time, and it's not a one-to-one. We could be using Markov chain analyses or other kinds of things. I think Dale was raising those points before. And data analysis, we need to establish methods to determine causality of mediation in experiments and make use of methods to account for dynamic and transactional phenomena. These challenges and conundrums become even more complex when we turn our attention to a promotive science to enhance positive youth development in cross-setting systems and policy interventions. Jonathan, it's yours.
So, you know, that was a nice handoff. And so I'm going to talk about, first of all, you know, I sometimes feel like if you put a picture like that up on a screen, you can just say thank you and walk away. You know, dress a kid up in an American flag and a graduation hat and you're good to go. So, but, you know, in many ways, you know, this picture is really supposed to exemplify what we want for our young people. You know, we want them to be productive citizens. We want them to be an added value to their own communities and an added value to themselves, right? So that's where we start from. And so what I'm going to talk about over the next 15 and a half minutes will be really building off what Ed talked about and going beyond individual settings and contexts, and for the purpose of saying that we need to create transformational change for young people in this country. That no longer can we start to talk about incremental effects. And so I say with a lot of humility that I have deep respect for the public health perspective. I attend to it in many ways. Even as a developmental psychologist by training, I do attend to the public health model. But that, you know, as I've written about with colleague Becky Smurden, we talked about we need to start to reconceptualize the way we see young people and put them at the center of our thinking, of our strategies, of our initiatives, of our policies. And that we need to, in a sense, marry a public health perspective with somewhat you could call a psychological perspective or an individual perspective. And when we bring those two together is when we'll start to see transformational change. So I start with that as a premise. And with this issue about going across settings, it's my hypothesis that when we start to go across settings is we will stop seeing incremental effects and we'll start to see multiplicative effects. And this, you know, Dale, your equation you put up yesterday, I think was, you know, I loved, and that was very much in line, I think, with the way we've been thinking around, again, if you sort of overlay that with additional settings, again, you see even more exponential effects. So that's where we're coming from. So why do we need transformation, right? So we're in a great country, freedom, liberty, justice, something for all. So if you look at some just statistics, and I just threw some on here last night, I could throw a whole lot more on. And so in a promotive way, I put on graduation rates instead of dropout rates, because that seemed like a much more optimistic thing, right? So over the last 30 years or so, we've seen a hovering of graduation rates around 70-75%. You know, so this was, you know, sort of civil rights movement comes, big bump in graduation rates, flat. So since the 1970s, relatively flat. You see a little bit of the, you know, sort of kind of wave motion around, and people will stand up and cheer and say, this year we're up by 2 percentage points. And then the next year it's down by 2 percentage points. And so if you look at the trends, it's pretty dismal. If you look at our urban centers, and this is also the same stat is pretty much similar for African Americans, Hispanic youth, and even more drastically for Native Americans in this country. Horrible graduation rates, 50% or less. So if you look at, here's just some examples of cities. You know, so you see 41%. Indianapolis has, I believe, the lowest graduation rate of the top 50 cities, you know, by size. Places like Gary, Indiana, like to hold the mantle, I think, for lowest graduation rates, period. You know, I put Boston up there because Boston, by many, is seen as the answer, right? They say Boston is about innovation. They figured it out. And in fact, when I moved back to Boston from DC, I was at several meetings, and I'd walk in and say, I'm so excited to be back here. And the reason is that you've got it, and I'm excited to learn from you. I think I said that at a total of 2 meetings, because the dirty looks I got when I said that was really telling. And they said, we have not figured it out. Clearly. So 58.6% graduation rates. This is based on Department of Ed data, Common Core indicators. If you look actually at the individual level data sets they have in Boston, it's similar. In the perspective I take on this is that we have to stop being relative in what we see as success in this country. That when we're relative in our thinking, 58.6% looks really good. If we start to be absolute about what we want in this country, it starts to look a little different, right? So let's start to look a little different. I should also mention, to take a promotive perspective on this, this is different than dropping out. Because if we look at this as what we need to do to get kids to graduate is different than what we need to keep them from dropping out. There's a lot of similarities, and I recognize that, and I'm cheer those on, and very explicitly. But if you want to get a child to graduate, not just to graduate with a degree, but to graduate with skills, that's a different strategy, right? And so it's not this, we get them back into school and lock the doors, we actually do something with them. And to think about that, and think about why promotion strategy is also important with prevention as well, is because DC is a good example. 9% of ninth graders, it was estimated a few years ago, will graduate from college. 9% of ninth graders in Washington, D.C. public schools will graduate from college. So it's not enough just to have them graduate from high school. What do we do with those? Because again, from a purely prevention perspective, it would be we don't want them to drop out. But if they graduate and still can't find a job, don't have the skills, don't have a lot of the competencies we've talked about, what does it matter? Right? Jim Heckman has done some really interesting work looking at GEDs as an example of this, right? We can give all the kids GEDs, but when you look at their labor market outcomes, they're no different than dropouts. And so there's clearly something more. So why do I have the perspective I have? One is just I have it, so I've self-selected into my job at America's Promise, or as a relational perspective, and we've developed together. So coming out of that summit for America's Future, which you saw yesterday, a picture of which I've never seen before, so it's nice to actually have to get that picture from Gene. Founded in 1997, it's the nation's largest cross-sector partnership, and we are multi-sector. Really do have everyone under the sun. Every youth development organization, numerous corporations, faith-based, education, government, all together, with the idea that no one individual, no one organization, and no one sector can do it all for all young people. So we have to work together. Our founding chair, General Powell, his wife, Mrs. Alma Powell, is our current chair. What do? So we do a few things mainly. One is we try to raise awareness. So we try to throw those gloom and doom statistics up there to get people energized, right? So we're doing poorly as a nation, what can we do together? We engage in advocacy, not only around policy, although we do that a lot, we also do that among our 400 plus alliance partners to say, here's how we have to work better together, and that is a form of advocacy. How do we change internal policies in the private sector, not just in the public sector? And then we try to create opportunities for action. We do a lot of that through catalytic work. So as an example of that, for 2 years, 2008 to 2010, we had a dropout prevention campaign. We first called it the Dropout Campaign, and took us about 6 months to realize we had to change the name, strikingly. We had figured that part out. We actually could do that pretty well, is get the kids to drop out. So we had to prevent that. So we actually held summits in all 50 states on the state level and in 55 of the biggest dropout factories as defined by Bob Balfans. And the idea for the summit was not to have one more conference where you could pat yourself on the back and say, hey, I've attended another conference. We've all done that. But it was actually, there was financial incentives for those communities to then create action plans that they had to submit to us within 3 months after the summit that actually said what they were going to do. What we turned out getting were plans to plan, because 3 months, as many of you know who do community work, is clearly not enough. Right, so you need more. But at least it was an action. We engaged actually Ken Dodge in his shop, Center on Child and Family Policy at Duke, to do an external evaluation of this. What we found was 18 months post-summits across the sites, we had about 85% of sites still had some sort of action going on, and about 50 to 60% had actual real, what you really define as true actions. So it wasn't just we're kind of meeting, but it was actually they had leadership, they had funding, they had something going on. So we kind of felt pretty good. I had no idea we'd actually be that successful. I was thinking 30% would actually be pretty good, would actually be pretty successful because it was really a scattershot approach. But that's what we got. So what we got was a lot of communities come back to us and say, what do we do now? How do we actually do this collaboration stuff? It sounds great. And a lot of what we base this on is around the 5 promises. So this is a basic youth development framework. You know, we said 5 instead of 40. You know, where they came from, there's a lot of debate. You know, Rick Little had its influence around this. Bill Milliken from Communities and Schools, the founder, had his 4 basics. And one story is that he gave us the 4 basics and then we added a 5th, you know, which was a healthy start, I believe. But we got those. So based on practice and affirmed by research. You like
Such
that?
a nice way of saying that.
Thank you. I was going to see the nuance there. Okay. So the Grad Nation campaign has been built off this prevention campaign. It's to say, now we've defined the problem, let's actually promote action to the solution. So we're trying to start a movement here, which is to get communities to sign on that abide by these things, which you can read for yourself. So again, they're coming back to us and saying, we get this, we've bought into this, we're doing this, we've been with you probably for 15 years, as of April 27th will be our 15th anniversary, but how do we do it? And there's not a whole lot of evidence to support this. And I should throw the caveat in, everything I say that's critical, the one exception is the man, type it on his computer, Rico Catalano, and his work at CDC is the one that is not included in all my criticism. So I just, not just because he's sitting in the room.
That's at least one.
That is a reason, but the real reason is because there's actually real evidence to support that model. So the perspective that we're taking is, that we take with America's Promise is around developing youth systems. And this is different than school systems, it's different than social service systems. What we got sick of going into meetings about was you talk about, get people saying we have to reform school systems, we have to reform the systems in classrooms, we have to reform human services systems, and you never heard the words kid, child, youth, student, or anything around a young person, right? That term was never used. So you forget about the child when you talk about reforming systems. And so for us, we wanted to put youth at the center. So we have to reform the systems around the young person. And that, and we had a basic idea about this, is that if you focus on all young people, or all young people are focused, the more focused and the most vulnerable, they get the 5 promises, they'll be prepared for life in some way, right? And so when we're thinking about youth systems, and this is really probably not the best way to actually show this because it's much more dynamic than this, but my graphic design skills are at a minimum. My grad students' graphic design skills are only slightly better, which is why you get this, and not like a figure of like a line drawn of a kid saying yay. I mean, that's kind of the only difference. But what you see here, again, it's very much built off relational models of development. And it sort of takes a design aspect to relational models. That a child is at the center, and that they have their own individual strengths, and that those strengths need to be aligned with this interconnection of key developmental resources that are built around them. So that's where we start from. And again, basic developmental theory, it should abide by these various things: early, don't stop, multiple contexts, multiple skills, and needs to align. But what actually happens in a community? Well, you have this gap between the supports you see in a community and what a child actually experiences. And so if you do a variable-centered approach to this, and we've seen this in our own analyses and other analyses, you look at a community, it doesn't look half bad, right? You know, if you put a huge YMCA in there, and a big Boys and Girls Club, and a Big Brother, Big Sister, all of a sudden you're going to see a lot more siloed assets for children. It's when you collapse them into a more pattern or person-centered analysis is you don't see as rosy of a picture, right? And so you get systems level might actually look halfway decent, individual level doesn't look so great. And so that's where, again, public health, psychological perspective coming together. How do you make them meet? Because both are important. You need to increase opportunity for all kids, but then you need to zero in not just on the most vulnerable kids. I want to make that point, because again, most vulnerable will probably not be defined as those off track for graduation, right? So if I'm on track to graduate, I'm no longer considered at risk. However, I still might not get a job after graduation because I have no skills to do that. I don't have these other competencies that I have. So how do you create youth systems? Well, in the town I live in, Newton, Massachusetts, thank you, how about 6 or 7? Fine. I think I can do it. Thank you. So in where I live in Newton, Massachusetts, I decided to, and I used to live on Capitol Hill in D.C., and I had not a lot of choice. I didn't have a big buffet to choose from of things, and I can navigate this pretty well. Where I live now in Newton, Massachusetts, I moved there for the schools. There's a lot of green space. I have the ability to choose from anything I want for my child. It's great, and a lot of parents in that neighborhood do. Go into Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, complete opposite. So even for those super parents who are able to navigate, it's still difficult to even find those opportunities and just the other externalities that have been talked about. Schools can do it. Community schools as an example of this, right? You know, put it all into a school. Research is out about how well that actually works. My bias is towards comprehensive community initiatives. And there is now, it's sort of become the lingua franca of community change, right? And if you can see a list of different things that are going on in the country around this, again, I would point to Communities That Care as the only one that actually has evidence for effectiveness. Strive gets a lot of play, gets a lot of traction, right? It's got great marketing materials, zero evidence for effectiveness, zero. Grad Nation Communities, that's what we do, zero evidence of effectiveness. Promise Neighborhoods, zero evidence of effectiveness. But they're trying to build an evidence base to their credit, right? It's all supposed to be about the Harlem Children's Zone, which, as all of you probably know, is non-replicable, right? And so that's, you know, Promise Neighborhoods are not promise like Harlem Children's Zone.
There's a promise there.
There's a promise there somewhere. So, to this point that Ed brought up, what is our unit of intervention? For us, it's this idea of an impact model. And that impact model is going to vary by the situation of the child, of the family, and of the community. And so for my sort of takeaway here for what we need to do as a field is to start to say we all are doing incredibly important work in individual settings. How do those settings become integrated and coordinated around an individual child, right? And how does that align with the child's own agency of their own competencies? And that is when we will see that impact. So if we create impact models that will then create youth systems, we'll see that impact. As a field, we're so far away from understanding impact models. And so we're just starting with America's Promise to try to just untangle some of the mess that occurs in communities to understand how this works. To Ed's point, we have to start understanding how to measure those interconnections. Because again, we're pretty good at measuring the silos, but we have to be better about measuring those integrations. So it boils down to two main issues: how to get information on these programs to the communities that need the information. CTC has a really nice model for doing that. Are there other models for doing that? There's this struggle that we talk about this translational research aspect. You know, we can translate it, but will people use it? Okay. And then how do you design youth-centered strategies that result in positive youth systems? So, okay, now we've got all these siloed strategies that are now in a community, and that's great. A huge step, and we see from a public health perspective, it has not just significant, but at times substantial impacts. To go from substantial to transformational, so when you walk into a community, you say, this now feels different. And isn't that what we want, right? We don't want to just say, it's better. If you go into Detroit and you have substantial changes, that's going to get you from 37% graduation rates to 42% graduation rates. Substantial. Nobody would say that's a bad thing. When you walk back into Detroit, you will see no difference in how you feel, right? And so we have to understand how does that actually transform a community and transform the lives of the young people. So to do this, there are many issues we need to address. How does development occur not just within settings, but across settings? So the idea of a latent construct of care in adults. So mentoring, when Jean made this point yesterday to say, all of a sudden it became everybody needs a mentor. Everybody does not need a mentor, right? And she'll be the first one to admit that. So I'm not just saying that because she's now not here, right? But everybody does not need a mentor. What they need are caring adults that they connect to in their lives. That's the important thing. So we have to understand how that relational dynamic occurs. And we need to have some basic research to understand how this relational dynamic plays out. So for individual kids, it's going to differ how much of this and how much of that. I mean, if you think about it as a tuner on your stereo, right? And you tune it, and so you have a little bit of bass, a little bit of treble, a little bit of this, and you're trying to get that right sound for you. And for a kid, that's really what we're trying to get at from this person-centered approach, is when we turn that dial, how do we get that, that right balance? And so then it's a design aspect, which is, I think we're pretty far away from that now, but we need to get there quickly. And then we need to create, and Ed already said this about research and evaluation designs, but I do want to mention this thing about funding research just quickly on that. Because what we find is, and this is a struggle we have, and I'm not saying this just because it's but when we fund settings, and incredibly important, and settings are essential but not enough. Right? You can say that about schools, after-school programs, anything. It's not enough. What we have to start to understand is, again, that relation across settings, but we need the funding that enables us to start to understand that relational development. And so we have to open up funding streams that enable us to do that. So I'll stop there.
So I'm here. I'm a national program leader for youth development research. I work in the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which is also the home of the 4-H National Headquarters. And I'm here kind of wearing two different hats, one in my role as a national program leader for youth development research, and the other, I also represent the Department of Agriculture on a federal interagency working group on youth programs, which is comprised of 12 different federal agencies across the federal government, and some of the work that we're trying to do collaboratively. And I think I was just counting up how many different federal interagency groups I'm now on. I think it's about 8, and I serve on Valerie's bullying research group. But when
integrate the integrated.
Right. So when I first started at USDA about 7 years ago, I remember asking someone that I knew at the Department of Health and Human Services, are there any groups, interagency groups that are focused on youth development? And she kind of laughed at me and said, "Oh, that will never happen." And now 7 years later, there's like a plethora of groups, which is really exciting. But so this is my simple slide. So from a policy perspective, how do we frame positive youth development? I think, as you all know, it's much easier for policymakers to understand risk prevention and statistics like decrease in dropout, increase in high school graduation rates, decrease in gang involvement, those kinds of perspectives. But how do we get stakeholders to understand the value added of skills such as leadership development, or critical thinking, or decision making, or goal setting, or teamwork? Corporations call these 21st century skills, but that they're also called the soft skills, the fuzzy skills, and I don't think it's something that necessarily translates into long-term benefits for most policymakers. So we have a grant program, for example, called Children, Youth, and Families at Risk, and our partners at the land-grant universities would like us to call it Children, Youth, and Families of Promise. We can't change the name. Congress has given us this name, so we just call it by its acronym CIFAR. But so a risk perspective is almost imposed on us, even if we don't want to use that kind of perspective. When I first got involved with the Federal Interagency Working Group on Youth Programs, it was called the Helping America's Youth Initiative under the Bush administration. And we now have on findyouth.info.gov, which is our website, we have an evidence-based programs database. And when we first were putting it together, you could search the database by risk factor, but there were no protective factors at all. So at that time, it was just me and a colleague, Trina Englund, who's at the Department of Health and Human Services, who really advocated for the inclusion of protective factors, and that was a huge novelty at that time. Like, protective factors, what is that? So so that's one of our challenges, is how can these core components of positive youth development really be placed in the context of 21st century skills, and how can we what kind of research do we have to demonstrate that success, learning these skills will lead to success in education, work, and family life. So I think some of the models that we were shown yesterday, which show both testing the reduction of these risk factors, such as a decrease in antisocial skills and an increase in protective factors, such as prosocial skills, are really important for us to be able to push this model of positive youth development amongst policymakers. Our other challenge is really having a clear and consistent definition of terms. We use a lot of different languages. People have said a lot of different language to mean the same things, and what happens is that the meaning is just gets lost. one state 4-H program leader in North Carolina, what he said he's done is just boil down what they do in 4-H to 3 major outcomes: workforce development, education, and health. And those are the 3 major things that any policymaker or stakeholder, state legislator can understand. What we did in the Federal Interagency Working Group for Youth Programs is we came up with a joint definition for what positive youth development is, and this is our definition. It's kind of long, and this was quite a process, as you can imagine, among 12 different federal agencies, ranging from Department of Justice to Health and Human Services. But the reason why this has been really important for us is that it has given us a common frame of reference in a way of explaining positive youth development to people who don't really understand what it means. We are now including this definition in our request for funding applications. So we all made the agreement that we would use this common definition in our request for proposals. It has also given us opportunities for collaboration, helping to break down some of the silos by having a focus on some common outcomes and ways of prioritizing outcomes through our funded programs. We actually had to come up with a short version of this definition because people complained that it was too long. The other point that I wanted to make, I was trying to find a good picture of development. I had a hard time finding something, but the positive youth development doesn't happen overnight. With prevention or intervention programs, you can implement a 6 or 12-week program, and you can expect that you might see certain kinds of outcomes. But positive youth development is a gradual process. We don't have the luxury of waiting 20 years to see what sorts of impacts we're gonna get. We don't have the money to do that, and we don't have the time. But we want to know that we're making a difference. And I think some of the work like that Chochim's doing at Cornell, where they have this golden spike concept where you look at proximal outcomes and that are shown to lead to longer term outcomes through many of the longitudinal studies that you're all involved in. And that might be enough to know that we're going to have an impact if we can achieve these proximal outcomes. And let's, like as Dale said, let's focus on making a difference in terms of how we're implementing the programs and improving what we do in our practices. I think it's also, we don't do enough in the positive youth development settings about looking at evidence-based practices. And just really simple, elegant examples like the one that Jean shared about mentoring and just doing a better job at matching mentors to mentees based on common interests. A practice like that could really have a lot of traction in a positive youth development setting, but I don't think the diffusion of those practices does not get down to us at the practitioner level. Also, there's also the challenge of many of our programs in 4-H, for example, we rely very heavily on volunteers, and so those individuals need to be trained. And Steve was just saying, like, how do you can train them and teach them what those are, but are they actually going to implement those? We also don't really know a lot about what, as John was saying, crossing settings. So we believe that we're doing all of the things that were demonstrated in the last panel about engaging youth in non-formal educational settings, with creating positive relationships with caring adults, showing the relevance of what they're learning to the real world, and engaging them in citizenship and community service. But we don't know what those practices, how those translate to formal educational settings, and whether they make any difference in terms of academic achievement, motivation, or engagement in school. I think we also have a tension with cooperative extension. I think there's a tension and a challenge between the grassroots approach to development of programs and implementation of entire evidence-based programs. And so we struggle with the notion of replicability and scaling up. We haven't been as careful as perhaps the prevention field in testing the replicability of programs. And so that's another area of opportunity, I think, for us, is really understanding what practices that we're doing can be replicated. Finally, we also need to understand long-term outcomes. So what happens when youth age out of formal programs? In 4-H, most youth age out when they're about 18 or 19, but the youth development processes, for those of you who have maybe young adult children, doesn't end at 18 or 19, and it's now not good enough for people just to have a job. People in 4-H want, as a long-term outcome, they want youth to be engaged in a meaningful employment where they can make a contribution to their employer. So we're also looking at pathways for engagement beyond just the formal structure of the 4-H program. I recently had the opportunity to do a focus group with a group of college-age 4-H alumni, and the reason why they wanted to continue to be engaged with the program is because they wanted to give back to the program that made so much of a difference in their lives. And how do we kind of tap into that, for some of our older youth, young adults. And finally, we just have, as was mentioned, the challenges of measurement. We do need more precise measures of positive youth development constructs. Rich just left, but he and his team have been doing a study, I think, as everyone knows, of 4-H youth development, and they've boiled down, I think, an hour-and-a-half long survey into a 13-item positive youth development questionnaire, and people are so excited about that because what I hear is that the youth are over-surveyed, they are burned out, they don't want to sit there like school and take a 2-hour questionnaire, and we need things that are reliable and valid, but easy and practical, as Ed mentioned. And I mentioned a little bit our challenge of identifying common outcomes, indicators, and measures. So this is really the bottom-up approach and how we can meaningfully accrue this data, aggregate this data, and make some sort of statement about what our impacts are. I also really like, Dale, your emphasis on shifting on the emphasis on improving practices rather than just looking at impact. And I think we need to take a look more closely at the quality of what we're doing rather than just worrying about change in knowledge or skills as a result of participating in the program. So I think, there's my, that's my last. So that's it.
Well, I think I'm going to be brief as well, and just really, I think this meeting is just so important in helping us to understand where there are avenues to advance the science. And so I'll give you a little background information on funding patterns, but I'll also talk a little bit about what are the important priorities for us and where you might see avenues for support. Most of you know about NIH and its budget. What I don't know is whether you're aware of, am I doing it right then? Whether you're aware of that the vast majority of our funding is extramural, going to the research community, and of the extramural funding, vast majority of it is investigator initiated. So that opens up a lot of avenues for you all to think about what investigator initiated opportunities there might be for positive youth development. And absent a program announcement or a funding opportunity announcement, what kind of program of study can you build that would fit, let's say, for example, within the NIH mission overall, focused on extending the healthy life and reducing burdens of illness and disability. And I think you can make a really, really strong case for that, given what I've heard today, and thinking about the long-term implications of some of the work that is going on here, and as well as the long-term implications of the flip side of, for example, the promotion indices that you've pointed out, that there's a real case to be built for this work fitting within the context of the NIH mission overall. And these are just briefly their goals, but this gets at some of the kinds of things that we were talking about for youth development and for meritorious science. So making sure that we have the resources to help prevent disease, and some of those resources are human resources as well as technological resources. but making sure that we have parents, educators, coaches, all of the actors that you all talked about this weekend, or is it weekend? These last couple of days. I feel like I'm on, on a weekend retreat or something. Are all a part of those resources, and certainly, talking about the economic well-being, the nation's economic well-being, you have a great case to make. You all have seen this many times, but what I really want to point out here is that the usual cast of characters that we've been talking about this week are mental health and NICHD, but it's really important for you to get to know some of the other institutes because all of us have requirements for health disparities, to address health disparities. We also have requirements for behavioral and social sciences research that might be relevant. So to the extent that your work might have to do with early sexual debut and adolescent pregnancy, for example, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases might be a place where you might consider Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, although here's a little bit of juicy gossip that they're getting ready, they're in the process of merging again with NIDA, and so those discussions are going on. So we don't know when or whether that will happen, but just to be aware that these things are in discussion. What I don't often hear groups like this talking about are the relevant priorities at the National Institute on Aging. We think about gerontology with that institute, but really the age group that where we end our primary focus, the Aging Institute takes up, and Aging and NICHD used to be one institute as well before they separated. So the Aging Institute might very well be interested in looking at adult development issues and the extent to which the adults have the wherewithal, let's say, for example, to be these actors in the lives of youth to help promote their development. Now, they would be looking for other kinds of outcomes than we would be looking for. But it's important to get to know some of the people in these institutes that might have areas of interest that may not be reflected in their title or their program headings, but in fact where we do have lots of shared interest. One of the other things I would recommend is, as you're looking at the funding opportunity announcements and the program announcements, look at the list of NIH institutes that have signed on to a particular funding opportunity announcement. And at the end of that announcement, they will have the contact person for this particular funding opportunity. So you might find the name, let's say if aging was listed on a relevant opportunity announcement, you would find the name of that program officer and just contact that person. I give you permission to say, Valerie said you can call me. Because we do share a lot. And in this climate of diminishing funds, we do lots of collaboration across these boxes and boundaries. And so we often do point people in the direction where they can get support. We had a really lovely discussion last night at dinner, and also with Anne's presentation about international and global health issues. You may want to talk to the folks at the Fogarty International Center about relevant research. Most of the institutes also fund international research, so it's really important to get to know these institutes and agencies. And I think to make it a little less complex, if you think about NIH like a university, the director of NIH, Francis Collins, you might think of as the president of a university, and all of these institutes you might think of as schools and colleges at a university, and the directors of these institutes perhaps like a dean of a school or college. And that helps to kind of make it a little less complex. So when you're looking to help your child find a place and find a major, you go to that school, you go drill down and see what the priorities are that the dean has set, and the various departments within a department or a school or college. At NICHD, before I get to NICHD, I just want to generally again indicate how much funding goes to the different kinds of research. And I'm sorry Joanna's not here, but we've talked about the research and training, the vast majority of that money going extramurally to your institutes and agencies. but there's also a good deal of funding for career development awards and training, some for research centers, and that I think that number might be adjusted given the funding issues, and other kinds of support.
By adjusted, you mean adjusted down?
Well, it could be. I don't know, because centers are huge. So if we fund a center, I can only speak for my institute in general. If we fund a couple of big centers, and that might mean that there's less funding for an RO1 or RO3 or something like that. So there's so those are things. I mean, you don't have to worry about, well, gee, if I apply for this center, will my grad student get their career development award? That's not what you need to worry about, but just be aware that institutes may have a cap on the number that they fund, or if they're funding a center and they want to see it achieve its aims, that they may not, even though that mechanism may be active for them, that they may not choose to fund a particular research center so that they can make sure that the one that they're currently investing in is able to bring its aims to fruition. Quickly, some of the funding for behavioral and social sciences overall, it's about $3.5 million in 2010. I don't have the 2011 numbers, but you can see that the vast majority of funding for the behavioral and social sciences, as the key words, I should say, that we used to kind of come up with this chart were primarily NIDA, and you can see NIMH funded a significant amount of work in the behavioral and social sciences, followed by NICHD, the Cancer Institute, aging, and alcoholism and alcohol abuse. So even though these bars give the impression of a small amount of funding, you can still see that $300,000, even $200,000. I mean million. Excuse me, million. It's not chump change, and it can really advance a field forward. I did a quick search just for your information on some of the spending on prevention research from 2008 to 2010. Some of the those of you that might fondly remember the Recovery Act funding, and so just taking a quick look at prevention overall. These dollars again are in millions. So just looking at the actual amount in 2008, the actual non-era in 2009, and do I have a 2010? Yeah, here's the non-era 2010. So you can just see the trend overall, and then breaking it down in terms of looking at substance abuse prevention. We weren't tracking those numbers. There was, at that particular point in time, suicide prevention. If you start looking toward 2010, and some of the NIAAA focus on underage drinking, youth violence prevention cuts across our institute, NIDA, NIAAA, NIMH. I believe when we did this analysis, I believe the National Institute on General Medical Sciences also had representation at the table when we were kind of doing our fingerprinting, as we call it. So it just gives you a general sense of some of the funds. I didn't do a complete exhaustive search, but you can get these data on the NIH website and search the NIH Reporter, and you can look for different types of funding patterns for different disease areas. So NICHD, again, our mission is very similar to the overall NIH mission. Ultimately, we're looking for the well-being of all people. Here, through optimal rehabilitation, and that phrase is used very broadly, but our mission is very broad. We want people to be happy and productive and have everybody to have a chance to achieve their full potential. And so that certainly clearly is an avenue for positive youth development. And here, just very quickly, just to show, even as we drill down a little bit more, how the core principles of positive youth development are consistent with our program goals. that early experiences matter, lifelong process. Suzanne just pointed that out. Learning about reproductive health is really important, and that's not something that we talked about so much here. But if you think about what Rick talked about last night in terms of the numbers of adolescents around the world, and you think about adolescent pregnancy, you think about all the kinds of things, human trafficking, child labor, violations against women. You think about all the kinds of things that are challenges to women's reproductive health, and you can see where your goals would fit into this. And again, improving the lives of people with disabilities. We haven't really talked about that kind of diversity much in this meeting at all, but that's really important. Branches within NICHD where you might find a home. NICHD is organized, at least for now, in centers, and then within those centers, branches. I'm in the Center for Research for Mothers and Children, and my program is in the Child Development and Behavior branch. And we have about 8 programs which provide research and training and so forth on language and literacy, bioliteracy, health promotion. My colleague, Dr. Lynn Haverkos, leads that program, health risk behaviors. My program has now been renamed Child and Family Processes, Maltreatment and Violence. My colleague, Leila Esposito, now has the social and affective development part of the portfolio, and we have a focus on neurobiology, maturation, and so on and so forth. And this is in the Center for Research for Mothers and Children, Child Development and Behavior branch. This is probably where you're most likely to find a home. Also, in our Center for Population Research, the Demographics and Behavioral Sciences branch is also where you're likely to find a home, because they do the large population studies, adolescent health, and NHANES, and some of the others that they fund, but they look at population composition, diversity and change, consequences of diversity, and all of those things, but you can still see that well-being is a goal. Interrelationships among individuals, families, and community is also really important. What I tried to do here, if you can read it, is to take a look at, we were talking in our planning phone call about, 5 minutes, okay, I'm almost done. We were talking in our planning phone call about how and the funding priorities for NIH and NICHD in particular might match up with the foci for PYD research. And one of the things that occurred to me in having that conversation and talking about meritorious science is that what's often asked in the review committees is that the groups have a conceptual framework that they're following, and sometimes those conceptual frameworks are helping to guide that work, but also helps us to know whether or not that work is relevant to our mission and goals. So I decided to take the Bronfenbrenner model and just to kind of break that out to see where there's common areas of interest. And it seems to me that we've been talking about the individual work and all the individual factors. These are certainly things that we fund and that are funded across NIH. And you could see where you would have a home where your research would be deemed significant and where that aspect would have merit. In terms of looking at settings, classrooms and peers, what we'd be talking about a lot today, I definitely think for NICHD and some of our sister institutes, this would projects that would focus on understanding and unpacking those settings would be right on target. The relationships between and among systems, I think so. I put checks in both of those boxes, but I think that what's most important for NICHD would be their impact on the individual child or that family or groups of children or populations, as our Demographics and Behavioral Sciences branch would focus on. As we get down to looking at more distal systems, family work schedules, let's say for example, school systems and programs and communities and the media. While this is a key component for PYD, for NICHD, I think there would probably have to be nuanced presentation of your aims and looking at the extent to which we know how these systems might impact the child's well-being over the short and long term. For looking at the broader systems here, we typically don't do a lot of policy research and fund a lot of policy research, but only to the extent that we might want to look at how those systems might moderate or mediate particular child outcomes. And then looking at changes in systems and interactions in systems over time, again, we would perhaps want to take a life course perspective and look at the impact in children's development over time. So for us, it all comes back to the child. So, and the context within which that child grows and develops. So alternative funding sources might be needed for some developmental exploratory research and for some standalone qualitative studies. I tend to encourage people to give it a try, but I have come to realize that may not be fair because you put a lot of effort into putting your studies together, and then you might get a study section that may not agree with me, and I don't know how that would happen, but you might get a study section that may not see the value of an ethnographic study, for example. So those are things that you may want to get additional support for and then use that as a foundation for applying for an NIH grant. Some of the policy level analyses you'd want to get some additional funding for, and as I mentioned before, some of the research on systems. We do fund theory-building research studies, intervention studies, all of these. I have been successful in getting funding for intergenerational studies. We've got studies that we've been funding where the investigator is now on the third generation because that was the nature of that question. What are the long-term implications of child neglect? Is it transmitted, and what aspects of it are transmitted across generations? There's a Rand Conjur's study we're funding looking at economics and economic decision-making over the generations. So we do fund long-term studies primarily using the R01 mechanism. So there you have it. Most of this you all already know. This is the kind of gold standard here, and it's renewable, and that's why this is so ideal for those long-term studies and answering those questions. This is really ideal for what we would call high-impact, high-payoff kinds of studies where you'd be trying to develop theory, trying to test a program, or what I've heard over the course of the last 2 days where you guys are trying to bring promotion and prevention together, looking at something that's really highly innovative would be appropriate for the R21 mechanism.
Is that for both years, each year, or both years?
Together, $275,000. Yeah. So finally, just as you were talking about incremental science, what we're really interested in is advancing the field. So these are the kinds of things that we are asking. Is it incremental, or will it advance the field forward? We do fund some incremental science only in the service of helping to build a case for really making an advance in the scientific area. Real-world implications are really, really important for us. So this is some of the things that we are, when we do a presentation to council, we have a portfolio analysis. And one of the things that was suggested to us as a result of our portfolio analysis is that we have priorities in these areas, and we need to continue to do that. And we need to continue to support work where we're looking at common measures and developing methods and so forth, and more integrative work looking at some biobehavioral aspects of child and adolescent development. And I'll stop there.
While my panelists join us at the bride and groom table, let me just add in terms of funding, some of the things that Valerie and other people in ICHC work together with the Grant Foundation. So there are a number of massive experimental trials like the one that Susan McHale's involved in with 60 workplaces. And then so we have had good interaction in the past, and so we're funding Susan because they're looking really at the workplace and the impact on the family and the kids, but not what happens inside the family. So we have funded embedded studies in big experimental designs because it fits with our budget of those kind of things that just magnifies the potential information. Sometimes they're daily diary studies of family process, sometimes they're qualitative studies, but they're embedded studies in large experimental designs because the Grant Foundation thinks that's an incredible opportunity to leverage stuff. So.
And what we try to do, in an ideal world, it would be wonderful if we could have studies, let's say, for example, that are funded by NICHD or any NIH agency, and when we got to the threshold of moving beyond our priorities, where we would have these partnerships and move it over to Grant or to USDA or to the Aging Institute or to some other place, so that the work continues. The focus may be different. You may be pursuing a different line of inquiry, but in an ideal world, we would love to have this kind of collaborative of funding agencies and resources, so that the major questions that you're trying to answer, that you'll be able to find a home for it, and that you understand that you're going to have to negotiate and navigate that. And that doesn't always happen. We tried with our Military Families Initiative, we really tried to have that kind of process happen, and it didn't quite work out the way that we intended, but I think it's an effort worth continuing to pursue, so that where there's a lack of priority on one end, we would be able to find a home for that work on another end.
So we're open for questions, and we can follow the.
Oh, sorry, I started.
Stick up. No, I started that, so that was great. So stick up your whatever they are.
What?
Somehow the low class kid never leaves me. Ricardo.
I want to return us to the beginning, and just listening to this panel, it just reminded me of one of the things we've all been talking about, and I also pointed out in my presentation. We just need to agree on a limited number of PYD outcomes. We need to come together, and that's going to probably be the hardest thing we could ever do. It gives us targets. It gives us, common, it probably won't right away come to common measures, but at least common concepts. And that's going to be really pushing up against the kinds of comments that Susan was making. Agencies like to think about risk and, bad things happening. We really need to, and the problem is we have a very diverse field, and we all talk about lots of different things as positive outcomes, etc. And if we could find a way of, categorizing or agreeing to or whatever, a certain limited amount of things, and just push the heck out of it, it becomes politically, it becomes easier for NIH, it becomes easier for agriculture, it becomes easier for the other HHS agencies to say, oh, well, okay, well, that's part of the picture too. So,
and just to echo that, from the Alliance standpoint, we've had a history of, listening to the communities, and when we said focus on the 5 promises, that's what you want to promote, which are just input. I mean, those are not positive element. It was, people were all over the place.
Right.
And that's when we came down to high school graduation, because they saw it as a beacon. They didn't say this is the end game, but at least this is a beacon we can all work toward. The problem became when we said, okay, what's then what are the key indicators you want to hit along the way? And they're all those typical 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, which are important, but
no social emotion.
Yeah, I mean, nothing there. And so it would be great if, again, as a field, we could come together and say, here are the 5 things we want. And then we could put it into...
So you want to look at developmental context for those as well. But some of them could be these PYD processes as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should abandon the positive youth development processes. I just think we have to point them at some outcomes too. So I think both are necessary. I said that in my talk as well. It's only going to make one point. They're both necessary. That we that we come to more agreement upon, because the more that we're diverse, or, I mean, I don't mean that, it's good to be diverse, but the more that we have varying definitions, the more that New York Times editorial will point in our direction and laugh at us.
Yeah, and it will help us a lot in terms of one of the things that we had to do with this federal interagency working group on youth programs is prepare a federal strategic plan for youth. And so we have the plan that will be out in the Federal Register soon, but implementing that plan and how do we measure whether that plan is being successful and what kind of impact we're making, something like 5 outcomes or, that would tie into kind of longer term, processes like being self-sustaining and self-sufficient and the kinds of things that we want in the long term would be really helpful for us.
You can always keep all the risk behaviors in one thing, so fewer risk behaviors, and those include these 10 different things, so it can, anyway, I'm letting it go.
Quick comment, and then I have a very concrete question. The comment is just picking up on the common orientation notion, which I think is really important. I'm kind of struggling with that within New York State, and just with one organization, 4-H, because we do lots of different things, and people are trying to evaluate, and well, how do they evaluate, and what measures, and just trying to come together. And obviously, if we can do something like that within New York State, it doesn't need to be one state. So I'm going to expect Suzanne to figure all that out for me, and I'll pass it on. But just listening to people talk about their studies and refer to the theories, conceptual orientations that they came from. And it's not just youth development, it's the whole field of human development. Yes. And so it's not a real surprise that this sub-area would have diverse theories and measures and concepts. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to do something about it, especially because we're such an applied, policy relevant area, but I don't think we should be beating ourselves over the head and shoulders because that's the case. It's the way science is done. People come up with new ideas, and people come up with old ideas and put a new name on them. So all of that happens. Very concrete issue. Dale, Suzanne, and I attended a roundtable. I think Suzanne was a presenter. Excuse me, at SRA with people like Suzanne who do research in the context who are located in youth-serving organizations. So they're researchers attached to youth-serving organizations. One of the points that was, Deb Bielachewski or just Bielewski? Bielewski. Works for Campfire. American Camping. I'm sorry, that's right, American Camping Association. Emerita professor from UNC was talking about the difference between the kind of evaluation studies she does and academic research, and made the point that they get a contract or they get a mandate from their board, they run out, collect data, do some analysis, and report it, and boom, they're on to the next study. And she said, we got a lot of data sitting around. We don't have the time or the resources to analyze it. Well, I thought about 2 or 3 things about that. One was what Gene Rhodes did with secondary analysis of the public-private ventures study, which really took it to a much different level, and is an example of how to use that sort of program-generated data and then publish it in child development and places like that. Another was that my colleague John Eckenrode has for many years, he's the director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research. For many years he's directed an NIH-funded archive of data on child abuse and neglect. So if you do a study, federally funded study on child abuse and neglect, once you're done with your data, you have to ship it off to Cornell. Cornell then has a staff, PhD level, they give workshops, and you can get access to the data and in a usable form. So those were the 2 models I had in mind for that, with the idea that if we had standards of what's good enough, funding to support that, we could create an archive of youth development data, not only from pure research, funded research, but also from program evaluations, various places.
Exactly. We were talking about that at breakfast this morning, what would be a good product, and I didn't mention that one, but I was talking about the Child Traumatic Stress Network, similar kind of thing where it's a repository of not only data, but resources, measures, publications, and then materials that are translated for parents and military families and folks who need that information and want to use it for their programs or for their own information. And I think those are the kinds of tangible products that lend a different level of credibility is not the word I want to say, but that's the only word I can think of, to the product, because you have a level of to the program rather, you have a level of transparency by making that data available. You're using resources and leveraging resources. You're also providing opportunities for young scholars like Joanne and others and her students to have access to data where they can do dissertations and theses and all of those kinds of things. Young scholars who are on the tenure track who need to get publications out. You know, that adds a level of a panache, I guess, to the field by having opportunities for publications to come out from diverse sets of individuals who are doing this work, and also to have an applied arm where that information can be readily translated to folks who need it, and so that there's a process by which you can have access to that data so that everybody's not willy-nilly, you know, kind of slapping variables together and, you know, saying, here's my model, but that you've got a process that you're laying out and, you know, people are having the opportunity to have access to that network. So you're kind of drawing people to this field and setting a bar for what your standards for data analyses are and for contextualizing your findings.
So just sort of related but tangential to that, you may know that the Gates Foundation just funded $45 million to do all this observational and data collection in classrooms around the country. They actually took most of our grantees that Spencer and we had going. We've done this massive thing. So we're currently finalizing an agreement. Gates is going to pay for the digitalization and upgrade of an ISR is going to take the data, and Spencer and Grant together are going to give $125,000 each for $250,000. So for junior scholars can apply for $25,000 grants to milk that data set. So it's just an example of that kind of possibility.
Another point, just to bring it back, if we had a way to collect data like this, I think it would be an incentive for people to use common measures, because that would magnify the value of the data. You could begin to pool it more simply than you could have.
Right, and what they did is they then funded what they saw as the best measures around, and so it's multiple different kinds of measures, but it's still some finite subset, right. And then they're putting that in there, and so. Dale, I think you're next. No, you're not. Margaret's next.
No, well, I think I heard.
You were.
That's helpful. I'm okay.
I thought you were catching me because I missed you.
No.
But you were officially next.
I think this idea of basically using multiple sources for one project is really important. I mean, it speaks to the need for mixed methods, so that, you know, different, if you will, branches that might help support this one project, because there are different methods that need to be used in answering the question. I think you've addressed that in terms of the presentation. Yeah. So I'm comfortable with that. But the only thing, I said no comment, right? But the only thing I would say, I'm not sure how others feel about this in terms of making data sets available to young people. I think you probably heard me sort of mention this yesterday in one way or the other, but how do you make sure that making large data sets available represent one sort of perspective that you're in essence trying to understand the strengths that are required to get these outcomes, as opposed to focusing on the risks? I mean, a lot of young scholars are not, you know, privy to the kind of perspective about, you know, positive youth development and moving past this sort of deficit orientation has been part of the history, especially given that many of these data sets focus on urban youth. And we know that stereotyping continues to be a huge problem. How do you, make the data sets available, to support, young scholars, although they've not had access to new ways of thinking about, in essence, questions that are asked, interpretations of the findings, so that they don't, if you will, end up with a program of research activities that in fact are counter, to the intent of the research and database that you've allowed them access to. Because I feel as if, for ourselves, we have an incredible data set, and it was focused on looking at data sets, but one in particular funded by NIMH and other funders, focused on looking at just that, the heterogeneity among very, low resource urban youth. And we have, really incredible data in terms of economic status. I mean, in some cases, we went around to homes at night with a portable Xerox machine in order to get documentation of the family economy, because we wanted to look at the variability within, if you will, low economic status. And it's very, very rich data, and we have, a lot of, I think, unique measures of risk, but also of strengths. So my concern is that we have low attrition and really a good database because people trusted us.
Yeah, that's always a risk, but for our early child care youth development study, for some of the other ones that we support, there's training and orientation before people can have access to the data. So you can, depending on how in-depth and comprehensive this group wants to be with such a model, I think I would recommend that you look at the different types of models for how they are making data available, number one, and then you decide, what kinds of screens you want to put in place for who has access to the data. One of the things that we used to do is just create an analysis data set. Like there's a lot of noise with these variables, so you screen them out, and then you just have what you want to be available for public use. So that may be one way to consider it. But I think the opportunities are just unlimited for what you can do. We were talking. This would also help the peer review questions and concerns that we had yesterday. We were talking at dinner about having you all, for each of the professional societies that you belong to, there's no reason why you couldn't have a training or an orientation for people who want to review applications. And part of their training and orientation could be making them aware of what data are available and what these variables actually mean and how they're intended to be used, and all of those kinds of things. So building a rich program for the users of the information, for people who would be reviewing the scientific integrity of the data and the merits of the science that's presented. I think the opportunities are unlimited for what this community can do.
So when you have a really large database that you're contemplating and making available, could you apply for funds to help the process of getting it ready for general use?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Dale?
I want to go back to something Jonathan said earlier about the graduation as an indicator and needing other indicators along that continuum, because I think it's absolutely critical. At the community level and at the system levels within communities, not the federal system, but and at some level within the state systems, the desire to simplify in order to rally support is very high. They want it simple. They want to know what they're doing in that, and it's almost always dominated by educational outcomes and often narrow educational outcomes. Achievement test gap, closing the achievement gap, sensible but narrow thing, and the consequence of rallying to those things is often advancing direct paths and ignoring indirect paths, and as a result, eliminating many of the things that are likely to be most effective in actually changing those outcomes. The need for that kind of ready by kindergarten, reading by third grade, graduating types of things. And I think in the middle school, early high school years is both the open spot, if you will, and the right time for the stuff we're talking about. And getting agreement on what an indicator of that type would look like, whether it's engagement in your own learning or some, people can imagine beyond that. But I think it's not just a proximal indicator that has value in understanding the end indicator. It's also an indicator of something else that's valued, that contributes to the other kind of education thing, but has value in and of itself. And getting it to that level, I think, is critically important to change the local conversation and to change the way in which people are trying to both study the issue and change the issue, the transformational stuff you're talking about. So the need for that indicator in the set of indicators, making it into the final four, if you will, to use the sports type of thing. I think it's very important. I mean, I just want to be really clear about that, because I think it's one of the things we're most missing. Then getting another set of outcomes that we've been talking about, I think, is also important, and getting those to be the kind of combination that we've been talking about, some proximal, some other types of things. But the need to sort of deliberately go between simplifying and the complexity of what we're dealing with in ways that are more intentional. So rallying to an indicator at the top level so that you have it to build on down, then getting the complexity of some of the multiple indicators in the out of school, or it's going to be in the positive youth development area and stuff, and then some of the more proximal processes that cause those types of things or are related to those things, and getting that complexity, and then being able to go back after you have that to the clarity about what to do about some of those things is the process we have to get going. And in positive youth development, that process gets stopped in multiple times in multiple places. And for me right now, the one that's most problematic is that top one, where we don't have, the indicator. Again, it's going to be a complex indicator at some level. And the best I've been able to think about is something around engagement. That the extent to which a young person is proactively engaged and has the support needed to pursue learning. And whether so that sort of combines the relational thing we've been talking about and the psychological sense of engagement in their own learning or something like that, that would change a lot of the dynamics, I would argue, if we had it.
But I would just say that I have a grad student whose specific interest is on understanding, from a policy perspective, what happens when you have belief in reality, and how does that result in what decisions you make. And so it implies that you need the right data to tell you what the reality is, and when belief aligns with reality, you have good decisions being made. Now that is a hypothesis, but it's an interesting way to, I think, frame what you're saying.
Engagement is actually the outcome that a group of Noyce Foundation grantees decided on. The Noyce Foundation pulled us all together, all the grantees who are doing informal science education programming, and required us all to come up with a common outcome that we would all measure. And engagement was the one that we decided that we could all kind of rally around. It was like the big outcome that we could all agree on, and so that's what we're doing as part of our evaluations.
So I want to piggyback on Dale's comments of complexity, and he's talking about complexity of measures and measurement. And I was just struck by our movement to, this panel's discussion of a movement to systems change. And we have such great complexity in our interventions to change individuals, to change families. We're moving to greater levels of complexity. And I think that challenge of moving it at the measurement down to other levels is going to get greater. It's going to increase. What are we doing to change the settings, and what will be the connections between changes in those settings to changes in individuals, or changes in settings to changes in families to changes in other settings to So all of those connections are going to be really challenging to study, and I think, and will demand other methodological advancements, John, that we'll have to take into account. And it gives me an opportunity to highlight one thing that I didn't get to highlight in my talk, and that's, yeah, there we go. The idea of our multi-component programs and how we might be able to speed up our understanding of impact and what's working and improving the impact. And right now, the system that we're in terms of testing our models is we test the intervention as a kitchen sink, right? So we put it all together and we test it against nothing, okay? Which, or lots of other things that we might not know, unmeasured other things, right? Yeah.
We have no vacuum. So
and maybe we have an okay sense of what's there, but maybe we don't. And so I feel, one, we need to, in our randomized clinical trials, we need to move towards testing our interventions against the real standard of interventions too, rather than sort of some watered down piece. But another problem with this is the iterative process takes years and years and years. So we test, we get some effect, we write it up, we revise the intervention, we test again. And Linda Collins, who's at Penn State, is developing a model of evaluation called the multi-phase optimization strategy. It's called MOST, M-O-S-T. And it's predicated on engineering principles of trying to make our interventions more efficient and our evaluations more efficient. So she uses fractional factorial designs to look at different components of the interventions and to test different components against each other in a single trial, if you will. So you have multiple conditions in the trial rather than just an intervention and a control. And one of the advantages of this strategy is you don't need as many people. Okay? So the N, it's reduced in size in N per cell, and you're maximizing the power to examine those differences. And you can begin to get a clearer picture about what works more quickly. And so I think it's a real potential strategy for us to advance the field more quickly in terms of what's working and what's having the impact, especially if we go as we go to these very complex multi-system, multi-component interventions.
In terms of Doug's point, I think it's a really important point. And I think to add on to that, because I think we've not acknowledged this continuing problem as well today. But in using a strategy like that, it means then part of our task could be to look at those factors that are somewhat out of our control, that are socially constructed. I mean, so therefore, looking at, the character in terms of Valerie's sort of, organization by levels of the ecology, in terms of, sort of socially constructed sort of mesosystem sources of risk that are out of our control, but we can assess. So ultimately, you can look at, the impact of not doing something. And so maybe, a strategy like that, if we had, if we thought about how to document that, because we've not talked about the continuing problem of isms. And I don't want us to lose that because, just calling, our emphases urban schools and urban kids is not enough. We have to also address the fact that, there are these habitual and chronic, socially constructed conditions that almost guarantee that we will always have jobs as urban researchers. That's not good enough. So I just want us to sort of maybe end, some of our discussion as a reminder not to forget, that ultimately it is in our best interest from an economic perspective, to acknowledge that it may be easier to really try to confront the issue in order to do something about it. As I shared yesterday, calling on Erickson, that we may need to examine, if you will, is it in our best interest as a nation to continue not to address these issues post Brown 1954.
So the panelists have any response to any of this comment, or?
One thing I was just going to ask Doug is with this methodological technique, can you isolate practices that would then work in other kinds of settings, or are they tied to the particular, it's just comparing one component to another component within that particular setting?
If you had, if I'm following your question, I think you could, if that varied across settings.
If you varied the setting.
So if you varied the setting and varied the practice, you could create that kind of design that would be able to test that. And this model is partly predicated on starting with a clear theory of the intervention of what's supposed to work, and taking that component. Now, one of the problems is most of our interventions aren't easily compartmentalized or componentized. They have integrated components that influence the different processes, and we specifically built those. So pulling the component out cleanly is not as easy as it sounds.
Jonathan's going to have the last word before our esteemed host has the extra last word.
I'll miss my flight, and Velma will miss her flight, so that will be bad. So, just very quickly, but it's there's an issue when you talk about multi-systems, the complexity. There's an empirical question there about how complex does it need to get from an intervention perspective. So is it that you have to change all these systems? How much is it that, which clearly you have to? I mean, Margaret, to your point about there's isms out there and you have to address them, but how much is it to build the capacities of individuals to then navigate the systems on their own? And it's an empirical question which I don't think anybody has really studied, because it becomes less complex if you can empower the individual to navigate and negotiate adequately, then that saves you a whole lot of headache.
So I wanted to end with thanking Patrick and Ellen and all the other staff members whose names I don't know for creating a wonderful event, and to give you the last word.
Well, I'm gonna have the last words. I'll try to be brief. But first of all, thank you all for coming. It's just been a really stimulating and perturbing conference. Ed probably doesn't remember this. Well, that's a good thing, is what I'm going to try and say. Actually, Erickson would suggest that developmental perturbances were critical for advancement. But Ed probably doesn't remember this, but way back at some conference one time, I actually was talking to him in a hallway, and coming out of the conference, really disturbed by how much I was going to have to rethink things and how much people knew that I just didn't understand. But it was the first time I realized that was a good thing, and I sort of mentioned it to him. I said, oh, this is actually a good thing, that I'm really disturbed by what everybody's saying. I need to rethink this. Him being one of the people who had perturbed me at that conference. And he's been doing it since, and I really appreciate it. So thank you all, because I think we really have gotten somewhere, although I think we are far from settled. And I think part of why we're not settled is there is much to be discovered yet. We really are just starting to really pull things together, even though there's been enormous work done by many in this room and elsewhere. But also because there is what might be called incremental work to do. I don't know if it's incremental, and this is one of my complaints about NIH these days, is they ought to be funding incremental work, because science is incremental. And it really disturbs me, but that's for another day. Anyway, but I think the point is we should not lose what's incremental in our zest to be transformational about the well-being of kids. and we've got to keep that complexity in mind. So here was our 4 questions, and I think we made serious progress on each of them, and I'm going to present my stamp on that as of today, with recognition that I just threw this together trying to capture what I thought were some key things, and with the idea that I do like the idea of arrows and boxes at some point, because I think as tell students regularly, you got to get real simple about what you think is happening here, because that's what we can test. We've got this blunt instrument called science, and we'll try, but that's what we got. And it beats testimony and, as far as I can tell, revelation as ways of directing our efforts for kids. So here's where I think we might be, and I've sort of changed to intervention science because this is a conversation I've been having with Nancy over 20 years about what are the boundaries between promotion and prevention and treatment, and particularly if you think developmentally, they're all about trying to affect development. So it's really kind of, there's some similarities, but there are some real important distinctions. I'll refer you to a paper that Erwin Sandler did, and Joe Durlak and John Weiss. It was in American Psychologists in 2005, where they tried to look at the similarities and differences of these to think about a mental health system for kids. And the backstory of that was lots of very interesting conversations about these 3 senior people working on very similar things, having very difficult time relating to each other's expertise. And having fun of being part of that and listening to them and trying to help them do that, and insisting there must be a way they can do it. And the paper shows what they did. They really moved it. But let me give you some real quick things that I think we learned here. First of all, I think we've come to some recognition that we need to really be talking about constructs that are about dynamic systems interfaces. They aren't about people and they aren't about settings. But they've got to be they got to be put into person and setting language so that we can relate to the larger fields that within which we work scientifically. Partially because they won't get it otherwise, and they won't fund us, and they won't publish us, but also because there is a larger science of neurodevelopment and things like that that's very important and very valuable, and we should be able to relate to that. But I think we've come to some conclusion that it may be less about identifying personal characteristics of kids and key features of settings as it is about what is that dynamic process that we really want to try and capture. And that's new. I mean, Ed and other people have been working on this for a long time, but it's still new in the sense of we still easily revert to that, and the field certainly that we work, larger fields are certainly in that. Secondly, that we may, and this is what I've been trying to filter and think about a lot about what Margaret's been talking about very well in this meeting very regularly, which is how do we think about diversity and heterogeneity and understanding a large political, historical context, all of that while we're trying to talk about something that's pretty local. And so one of the conversations I think we need to have further, but is that these construct settings may really need to be kind of localizable. And I don't know what that means too much except for a given setting. So how you would talk about it in mentoring programs, or how you might talk about it in different countries, or how you might talk about it within a certain kind of group that you're working with. And so we may wind up with very much along the line of latent constructs that we all agree on, but they have they might have quite different names depending on who we're talking about and where we're talking about. And I think this positive development has the opportunity to help the field think that way. That methods that can assess what different programs do as a heterogeneous multi-process intervention and with heterogeneous populations. I didn't hear about multi-component programs here. This may be, I can't figure out if this is my contrary nature or my picky nature, but what I heard were more of multitudinal programs. These are programs that have multiple things going on so that different people that are involved with them. And I use programs to mean all kinds of things. I don't mean the sort of, here's my program off the shelf. I mean Boys and Girls Club, after school work, community. These are really multitudinal, and so they're meant to have multiple processes going on that somehow helps different people in different ways. And that's a very different understanding than there are 4 key processes that were given to everybody in the traditional public health model. And I think there's a great opportunity to think that way and build up from the build-up methodologies that we're talking about, both Nancy and John talked about, I think are wonderful opportunities to marry to that thinking. We need to find methods that cast programs as facilitating environments organized around the child. One of the debates that was right here at the end, was lovely to see it come back up, is do we really think about building facilitating environments around children and capacity to use those environments as a skill we're promoting, or do we want to create sort of environments that are thriving, producing, and kids who come through them or in them have the adequate opportunity to thrive kind of idea. And that's an age-old issue, but certainly one that's very relevant here. For another time, I can talk about some of the places we've gone with that with our prevention work over the years, as we've realized the facilitating environments shift and change as much as do the constancy of the child, so to speak. So the idea that you're going to fix the environment may be as much of an illusion as fixing the child is going to take care of. But that's for another time. This idea that multiple methods, and I'd like to expand multiple methods to mean potentially multiple quantitative methods or multiple qualitative methods, but mixing your methods for multiple lenses as a standard that we might want to think about. This is the first time I've been in a meeting where people didn't say, well, why do you have to do that? And I wonder if it's because this group recognizes that these multiple methods really are good different lenses, and the triangulation, or so to speak, or the getting what's real is really about how the methods line up, how something survives different methods rather than one method is better than another, or a single method is going to give us the insight we need. Closer relations to and building from the mainstream developmental neurodevelopmental understanding. Some of that is survival, that's adaptation to the current thinking, but also there's enormous information, I think, and importance in that. And unless all those people are really wrong, we should be relating to what they're doing in some way. I think it was Ann said the biological is the flip of the, yeah. And so we need to be thinking about how those processes that people, I just think about people who are trying to understand how does empathy develop as a neurodevelopment, how do you develop empathy, and what does that mean about it? And those kinds of findings are really very relevant for us, and we should maybe at a next conference engage with them. How do they see the world of healthy development? We need rigorous methods, not just methods, we need rigorous methods that can assess what different, and programs I put in quotes and didn't capitalize because I want people to get too hung up on, I mean a specific program, but things we do to try and help kids, that intentional interventions, do is heterogeneous multi-process with heterogeneous population. Again, that this idea that we're really talking about a different model that's as different from what prevention thinks as prevention is from treatment, about heterogeneity and about the processes that are going on. And I think that's where we're going to see some very exciting work in the next 10 years, both in the interplay between methodology and this question of how do we make programs better. I think Dale gave us a wonderful frame for that, that actually can go back and to prevention. It might be much more useful for prevention than what we've been using. And also rigorous methods that can cast programs as facilitating environments. So really trying, again, how can we come up with methods of what does it mean to be a facilitating environment? Because in that is the potential pitfall of having the cause and the effect as one variable. So when people say, well, we need to create learning environments in which the children will be ready to learn, well, you can't measure one without the other. Or if you do, then you can't really tell. And so how do we understand what that good enough environment is, I guess, or something like that, and what is adequate capability to make use of an environment? And we have to get into some of those nitty-gritty things. This ninth one, our values versus program versus community values, was a bit of a dinner talk where I and some other people were suggesting that if we actually thought about working with the values of the majority culture in this country, positive youth development would be, how willing are you to succeed at just about any cost? How important is money to you? I mean, all the things that we as a group who are not in concert with the majority values don't want and wouldn't be looking to try and to do better interventions to produce these things. So we have to sort of think about that issue of our values and what we think would make a good citizen, and even the issue of what we might, as a perhaps more educated, more informed, understand some of these importance, whereas if you just took a poll, people would say this isn't important. And so we have to keep that in mind, particularly as we start to try and think where we know we're working with cultures that we're not from and societies we're not from, and where the values might be quite different and maybe quite challenging to how we think about things. And also those are different from a lot of the programs that are out there. The programs carry certain values about what they think a good person is and what they ought to be trying to do. And we just have to, I think, clarify that a bit as we're going into measuring these things and trying to see about, does this work or not? And then how to make support efforts and opportunity more effective. So in other words, this go back, actually, this is a restatement of what Dale sort of said, not quite as well as he did, but I'm trying to get up there in a bullet point. But how do we really make these efforts better and more effective is a much better guide than does this work or not, or is this the best way to go or not. So that's what I've got. We've got a lot more to go on. I suspect, hopefully I perturbed some of you as I was talking, and because either something you thought was critical was not up there, or you were very upset that something did get up there. But that's partially for the time limit, but also because we've got a lot of work to do, and that's my quick take on trying to get some of this into boxes with that we could get some control over. We've got a great amount of opportunity and energy, and I think we should harness it. One very specific thing that we're going to move ahead with, and we hope that you will all participate in, is a special issue of the Journal of Applied Developmental Science. We're looking for manuscripts between 15 and 25 pages from you. It'll be exactly what the conference is about. It's your opportunity to write and take what you did and put it into perspective. To help the field move ahead and be a guide. We welcome if you've got engaged in some very useful developmental conversation for you with somebody and you want to write with somebody as a way of keeping that conversation going or formulating that, that would be great. If your panel would prefer to create a paper together, that's fine with us too. If people could send us like an abstract of the paper or 5 to 10 lines to let us know so we know who all is probably planning to send in and also what the likely set of papers are so we can coordinate those. We don't have a deadline yet, but I'm going to guess it's going to be the end of summer is what we're talking about. So any questions about that? The key is that they're all about this intervention evaluation of PYD, moving it forward. There's been talk about lots of other potential products, some of those depending on funding. So one was very exciting, it's just emerged here, was this idea of a network that could be collecting our data sets together, having those archived in some way. Rich and I are involved with the Military Children's Education Coalition, and we're doing a military PYD and military families summer institute. We're giving very small stipends to junior early career people to work on projects that would be about how positive youth development among military connected youth occurs and what might be important factors for that. And then we're donating our mentorship. So if we could fund that, one of the things that our center could help support and we'd be interested in is something like summer scholarship or junior scholars around these kinds of things. And if we could actually help support the mentorship of people. So that would help with, and I share your concern, having had people work on our data sets, that their data sets are just very complicated and they're very idiosyncratic, and so to give them to people is a little bit worrisome for good reasons. But there could be a way. And there's other models of, if we want to get more elaborate, there's been postdocs like in family psychology and so on that have been funded where people had networks through that, and they quickly created a cadre of very capable next generation investigators at T32. So I don't know if those options are there, or we can talk to the foundations and NIH and so on. The idea of some collaboration projects. Rick presented us with some ideas of potential opportunity of a large data set that might be potentially analyzable in ways that could answer some of these questions. I know there's Ann and other people are trying to talk about how can we think and work internationally and moving forward in this. And I know with Nancy, we're just even if we could come to, and this goes back to Rico's idea of maybe not the 6 best processes and maybe not the 6 most important outcomes for everybody, but 6 we all agree on and we'll work on because they're close enough. You know, my model is though it's better than everybody else's is not that much better. And if we could do that, I think that could be a critical piece. So those are some final comments. The last part is, what would you see as next, or are there comments you would like to make sure we get before we break the meeting up? We'll get everybody's stuff up on the web. And be thinking hard, and we've already got a call scheduled next week to think about what are the next steps with this and how we can move it forward, because this does feel like there's something starting here that's pretty important.
And the web is the Youth-Nex web?
It'll be the Youth-Nex, yeah.
You know, one thought I have is related to the last point you made. I know that we, within Youth-Nex, have started to collect measures that people are using on their product, sort of, so that there can be a library of measures. And that's been mostly, I think, internal to Youth-Nex funded projects or affiliated researchers at UVA. But it seems like that might be something, if people are willing to share, that Youth-Nex could do, is sort of widen that library, which also would allow for some of that thinking about, can we come to some set of what's common here, what are we looking at, what are the domains that we're measuring, and can we try to maybe think about selecting measures, having people select measures that are being used in other studies, sort of as a way to do that, if folks around this table are willing to start doing that.
Measures with a little OK Barros review. The measures with a little OK Barros review kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, reliability, validity, give some information to make it useful.
Exactly. Yeah. No, when I talk about library, I'm thinking really like that really describes, gives you some more information.
You know, the foundation has supported. It wouldn't if it's at the youth level here, but you know, in terms of the after-school measures of putting those out, and actually the Forum on Youth Investment did the hard work, but we supported it to get it out. But it was a setting level measure, so it's not some. But that's just a good idea, and the practitioners find that incredibly useful. I mean, the hits and the feedback on that is just unbelievable, because people are looking for something simple and with information they can understand. So it's written in a fairly simple way with an appendix that describes the stuff. So I mean, I don't know what this operation is completely about, but if Youth-Nex has that possibility, it's one almost clearinghouse to do that.
Well, we could be an organization. Funding would get to be an issue, but
Castle, the one in Chicago, Castle has put together some measurement inventories. I know there was one on middle schools recently that they've been working on, so that could be another resource you could look to.
Catherine Castle?
Castle Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning.
CASEL.
Castle, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another Castle here.
We have a
Castle
CASTL.
But that Castle may be, even a better place, because they've got increased sort of funding as a clearinghouse for that.
Yeah.
Maybe you should be talking to Roger or Paul Gorin.
And I think some of that might already be in existence. I know we looked at the middle school measurement recently when we were developing our high school survey to see if there were competencies that we wanted to take from that.
Right.
Yeah, and they've been working on the core competencies kind of model too. So
Yeah, they have their 5.
They're actually, the World Bank supported some measurement of kids' sort of perception of school climate. Do you know about that stuff in different countries? So it's sort of that kind of data that I know some people in NYU just did some factor analysis of that in different countries and things like that. So some of my colleagues.
Another piece is more conceptual, that we had the opportunity to work with Peter Benson and his colleagues at Search in 2004 for the Gates Foundation put us together to try to define what are the X number of youth development outcomes. So it's unpublished, but I'd be happy to share it with you guys if you'd like that.
This is a list that you came up with of...
It's a conceptual framing of what's, you know, what are the key developmental outcomes. Actually, it's about young adulthood, but it's a culmination of adolescence, given today that we're trying to define it 12 to 25 or whatever.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to me.
So we could happily share that with
That'd be great.
you, and then you could, if you wanted to, send it out.
Steve and Dale, how does the consortium and the repository that you have both been involved with, how does that fit into this?
Well, the consortium we've been talking about is the repository is in order to be able to capture the literature and archive it, so that it wasn't a place that was sort of only contemporary literature. It was actually a place that would be doing it. And Trudy Dunham at the University of Minnesota has been working with the National Ag Library and others to try to figure out what that would look like and create some terms that would make it possible to capture some of the literature to be searchable and things. And then to make it not a come to there to find things, but actually something that all of us could use as the place where we would put documents, and then our websites would refer to the specifics rather than to the other place to find it, in that sense. And then in terms of the consortium, the issues around how to, largely has been focused with Stephen's leadership and stuff around how to translate. So how do we take research that's been done and summarize and synthesize and even build consensus around what it means for practice. So it's not necessarily been thought about as a consortium for doing new research so much as it is a sort of consortium of bridgers of research and practice. Well, we've been talking about it for about, 6 months maybe, 3 months? And so Cornell, University of Minnesota, and Texas A&M are the three primary places that have been talking about it.
Talk to you about
Yeah,
that
I remember this a bit,
before
yeah.
that. Agreed. We have in mind a kind of, let's get started, then let's expand and have Youth-Nex, definitely.
You've been on the list of...
And communicating that stuff to the practical world, Nicole Yohalam is just so gifted. She works in Forum for Youth Investment with Karen, and she makes all that stuff happen in ways because she's also comes from that world.
That's right.
And so she's really gifted in translating that communication.
The forum might be a real good partner for this.
You have common sources of funding, right?
Well, we do, and as well as they're very good at sort of making that connection between.
Yes, they're fabulous.
Well, this is great. So let me get to the really important thing. So thank you. We got us, and I got us back to Jefferson. How you like that? And so, given how much he thought about citizenship and development, I think it's nice we got up there, but also to be optimistic given who's trying to work on this. Got some real potential here.
Maybe we can build it faster than build the house.
There you go.